Zarefah Baroud. Zarefah earned her PhD from the University of Exeter's European Center for Palestine Studies. Zarefah studied under Ilan Pape for her PhD in Palestine Studies and recently passed the defense of her dissertation with flying colors. So it'll be an amazing book. I can't wait to read the book. She is the second Baroud to study under Ilan Pape, and I can see why her Baba beams with pride over her accomplishments, and he really does. Her dissertation is a study of the function of carceral policy and practice under British colonial rule and Israeli settler rule in Palestine. So prior to her doctoral study, Zarefah received her MA in Policy Studies from the University of Washington, where she researched American aid programs to the Israeli military. She has given seminars at universities including Cambridge, Georgetown, University of Washington, and Tacoma College, and her work extends well beyond the academy. She writes for the Palestine Chronicle and also venues including Al Jazeera, Middle East Monitor, Counterpunch, and Mondaweiss, and you should read those if you want some real news. She has given numerous lectures and workshops. She facilitated a We Are Not Numbers workshop in Gaza, another at the Global Anti-Apartheid Conference in Johannesburg, and one at the Palestine Convention in Chicago. Zarefah has been interviewed about the ongoing genocide in Gaza by the BBC, the New York Times, not that that is, well, thank you for going
again.
into the New York Times. And every 40 or so times they do something that isn't bad. And ditto for the Washington Post. So she is always on point, passionate, moving, and eloquent in these appearances. And we are so lucky to have her as a lecturer at UH Manoa, filling a much needed gap with the retirement of Brahim Aoudeh. And as I will continue to do, we absolutely need to have a tenure line hire who specializes in West Asia and Palestine studies. Please keep telling administrators this repeatedly. It cannot be said enough. It is absolutely disgraceful that we do not have someone in that position. And from the glowing reports of Zarefah's students, I know that she brings to this class not only her scholarly expertise, but her abilities as a storyteller. And in this regard, you really should check out her work as digital media associate for AMP, or American Muslims for Palestine. Her videos are incisive, moving, and sometimes sharply satirical. The last time I had the pleasure of introducing Zarefah, it was alongside her father, Ramsey. I noted then, and it bears repeating now, that one of the pleasures of being in Hawaii these past 30 years is to see genealogies of resistance as scholar activists mentor their children and haumana who become the next generation working to realize a free Hawaii. So too for Palestine. These genealogies are beautiful and moving and sometimes funny, and so I'm thinking here of the father-daughter delight that Zarefah and Ramsey take in frozen lattes from Costco. It is a thing. If you ever want to find your way into Zarefah's heart, bring her a frozen Costco latte. Through these genealogies come the promise and certainty that from every river to every sea, the fierce love for land, for Ea, and one's people will win out over the violence of settler and fascist states. Please join me in welcoming Zarefah Baroud and also in admiring this lei that Mari Quinn of the SSJP has made for her with much aloha.
That was so beautiful. Thank you so much. Thank you. Assalamu alaikum, everyone. Maybe I could set this computer here. Is that okay?
Yeah.
Should I keep kind of like
Keep touching.
Sorry, I turned it on again.
Yeah, I think you have to.
Yeah.
Can everyone hear me okay? Or should I have it closer?
No.
No? How about like this? Is this better? Talk louder? Okay.
So just touch that every so often.
Okay, great. Salam everyone. Aloha, thank you so much for having me today. I'm so excited to be talking about this and kind of being able to geek out over some of my research with you. Usually people will say when you're kind of in the midst of writing your dissertation that it doesn't need to be perfect, 2 people are gonna read it. And so I like that I'm able to kind of share it with more than 2 people. This is fantastic. So today we're going to be talking about and discussing the ways in which Israel has historically operationalized carceral systems to advance settler colonial elimination, particularly against the Palestinian people in the West Bank and the Gaza Strip and across historic Palestine. Typically, prisons are often spoke about as a space of repression, dehumanization, but in the context of Palestine, they are much more nefarious than this and instead play a central role in the attempted Zionist elimination of the Palestinian people. Kelly Lytle Hernandez, for example, a fantastic scholar on immigration and mass incarceration in the United States, argues that incarceration serves as a key pillar for the settlers' structure of elimination and invasion, operating as, quote, a means of purging, removing, caging, containing, erasing, disappearing, and eliminating targeted populations from land, life, and society, end quote. And this is, of course, includes the disappearing of masses, specifically of natives from the settler's site, space, and psyche. To date, the Israeli military has issued thousands of military orders to cover every sector of Palestinian life, with the most literal surveilling and criminalizing of each sector, ensuring that the native Palestinians' posture towards Israel is that of a combat breathing, as Frantz Fanon speaks of. Israel's systems of carceral domination occupy Palestinian life as a whole. The exposure to carceral violence in all of its forms and dimensions shows how Israel exerts necropower on Palestinians, asserting its capacity to impose death on the native. So here's a critical passage from Elimination, speaking about life under late modern occupation, and speaking about it as, quote, a state of constantly being in pain. Fortified structures, military posts, and roadblocks everywhere, buildings that bring back painful memories of humiliation, interrogations and beatings, curfews that imprison hundreds of thousands in their cramped homes every night, from dusk to daybreak, soldiers patrolling the unlit streets, frightened by their own shadows, children blinded by rubber bullets, parents shamed and beaten in front of their families, soldiers urinating on fences, shooting at the rooftop water tanks just for fun, chanting loud offensive slogans, pounding on fragile tin doors to frighten the children, confiscating papers, or dumping garbage in the middle of the residential neighborhood. Border guards kicking a vegetable stand or closing borders at whim, broken bones, shootings and fatalities, a certain kind of madness. Now, this passage in particular, the work of Elimination of Kelly Lytle Hernandez, exhibits how all forms of violence, whether physical, psychological, carceral, and others, show how Israeli forces routinely employ both policy and practice to prove that the native Palestinian, that the occupier has the ability to impose literal or social death or the possibility of it at any given time. So I think now would be a good time to kind of use this framework for understanding some current events currently happening in occupied Palestine. On Monday, the Knesset approved a bill that will now be advancing to the Israeli parliament. Has anyone heard of this bill?
The death penalty?
Yes, the death penalty bill. So for the first time, Israeli military courts would be given or be sanctioned to impose the death penalty on Palestinians convicted of murdering Israelis on, quote, nationalistic grounds, or out of a hate for the state of Israel. Now, one could potentially argue that this isn't genocidal or eliminatory. The United States does this, which is arguably genocidal and eliminatory. But this bill, to kind of solidify itself and its intentions, would only apply to Palestinians, and Israelis would not be subjected to the same policy if they were to kill Palestinians on nationalistic Zionist grounds. What was stopping Israel before from implementing this policy? According to Israeli officials and parliamentarians themselves, there were deep security concerns that the murder of Palestinian detainees, that the murder of Palestinian detainees would threaten the well-being of Israeli captives in Gaza. But since their release, Netanyahu has deemed that this threat is now irrelevant. Hamas doesn't hold the same leverage anymore, and therefore has greenlit the advancement of this bill. Ben-Gvir, of course, National Security Minister behind this policy, is insisting, however, that the military court shouldn't actually have discretion over whether or not a Palestinian being accused of the murder of an Israeli that the courts shouldn't have discretion over it, and rather it should be an automatic measure of those accused. So what does this mean within a military court system with a conviction rate of 99.7%? What does this mean for the over 10,000 Palestinians, 10 to 11,000 Palestinians currently in Israeli prison, or the over 60,000 missing, thought to be dead or detained throughout the Gaza genocide, but aren't accounted for in custody? Many of them, the majority of whom are security prisoners or classified as security prisoners by Israel, will now be at the risk of capital punishment, particularly Gazan detainees who have been taken captive under Israel's unlawful combatants policy. So it is important to note that while Israel never officially integrated capital punishment in a legal form into its laws pertaining to Palestinians, likely out of the same types of fear of retribution and threats of retribution, but more and more Palestinians have been killed in custody in the last 2 years than we have seen ever in Israel's history, short but violent history. Since October 7th, 2023, at least 80 Palestinians have been killed in Israeli custody. This doesn't include the hundreds of bodies that were just released from Sede Taiman. We don't fully understand where they came from, if they were abducted from Gaza, if they were prisoners themselves. This is unknown at the time. But to go over some of these figures, in April 2023, the Palestinian Commission of Detainees and Ex-Detainees estimated that 236 Palestinians had been killed in Israeli custody since 1967, so since the beginning of Israel's occupation. Over the course of 56 years, these 236 Palestinians had been killed. I'm sorry. I'm so bad at remembering to do that.
It's an annoying feature.
This increase of 80 Palestinians being killed in Israeli prison, and this is an underestimate, over the last 2 years means that the rate of killing in Israeli detention has increased by 1,000% past the pre-October 2023 average. This, of course, includes the unprecedented torture that we are witnessing coming out of Israeli detention centers and a lot of these makeshift torture camps that Beit Salem reported on last October, such as Sede Taiman and others in the Nakab, which under a so-called prison state of emergency under Ben-Gvir's thumb has included frequent acts of severe arbitrary violence, sexual assault, humiliation and degradation, deliberate starvation, forced unhygienic conditions, sleep deprivation, prohibition and punitive measures for religious worship, confiscation of all communal and personal belongings, and denial of adequate medical treatment. Now, the last phase of Israel's genocide, or incremental genocide in Gaza, which followed Hamas's Al-Aqsa flood operations on October 7th, 2023, brought with them the most intense manifestation of carceral violence potentially in Palestine's history, proving to be a critical facet of its genocidal operations. Since October 7th, Israeli forces have arrested and detained over 30,000 Palestinians from Gaza and the West Bank, 15,000 of whom are from Gaza, with around 11,000 still in custody. If we take into account the rate in which Palestinians are arrested and the rate in which they were released during these prisoner-captive hostage exchanges, that would be 1 prisoner released for every 15 detained. But it's important for us to recognize these policies, such as administrative detention laws, the basis for military courts, which try and incarcerate Palestinians with the conviction rate of nearly 100%, which find their origins in British colonial policy, particularly the Defense Emergency Regulations of 1945, that were instituted incrementally by the British throughout its 30 years mandate over Palestine. And it's important that when we're looking at these systems and these policies, which create a structure of invasion generally, but a structure for detention in all of its forms, whether it's curfews, whether it's administrative detention or detention without charge or trial, a basis for military courts, house raids, closed military zones, all of these different forms of confinement. It's important that we look at the origins of these policies in order to fully understand their intentions and the ways that they've operated throughout history. Looking at these policies, we can then come to the conclusion, at least, that Israel's carceral systems are relics of colonialism and continue to function in the advancement of its settler colonial objectives, i.e. the erasure and elimination of the native. So let's take a quick look at these policies. Administrative detention, for example, or detention without charge or trial, are based on Article 108, 111, and 112b of the Defense Emergency Regulations of 1945. Again, British policy. So Palestinians, for decades before Israel ever existed, were subjected to the exact same policies, most literally, as well as military courts, which find their basis in the Defense Military Courts Regulations from the 1930s. When applied in the context of the occupied territories now, a detention order is produced by a security agency, usually Shin Bet or Shabak. This order is then fulfilled by a military commander instead of who was it at the time, High Commissioner or military commander, or Majesty's forces, unless it pertains to a woman or a child, and the process is changed slightly. But administrative detention, for example, would see to that a detainee can be kept captive in Israeli prison for 6 months, for 6-month periods that are renewable indefinitely, and they are often renewed indefinitely. I think it's very important for us to understand the ways that these policies also operated during Palestine's colonial past. I argue in my thesis that these policies didn't simply kind of manifest in an eliminatory way during Israel's occupation, but rather the rates in which Palestinians were being detained for their role in uprisings against the Zionist movement during the Mandate, such as the Great Revolt of 1936, would show and indicate that there was an eliminatory nature to the British implementation of this policy as well. So there's a fantastic British military historian, Dr. Matthew Hughes, who's actually on my defense committee. That was rough. And he, in his book, Britain's Pacification of Palestine, estimated that in 1938, Palestine had around 1,400,000 residents, the vast majority of who were Muslims, 900,000 of them, 111,000 Christians. And during the Mandate, he would estimate that over 8,000 Palestinian Arabs and some Jews were detained each month during the revolt. Assuming that 8,000 Palestinian Arabs were detained each month during the entirety of the Great Revolt, except for a period of so-called ceasefire, sort of in the middle, it can be calculated that British forces detained 264,000 Palestinian Arabs at this time. And then he challenges us to expand our perception of what incarceration means and decides to include also informal confinement, whether that's curfews, whether that was temporary detention during military raids and the like. So then he goes to double this number, which would mean, if this figure is accepted, 37% of the Palestinian population was detained throughout the course of the Great Revolt. Again, confirming both the extent to which carceral policy served as a principal strategy for British colonialism, but also manifested in a eliminatory capacity as well, with the effective disappearance of 37% of Palestine's population. Here are some archival images of British punitive home demolitions during the Great Revolt.
You should be able to click continue.
Oh, should I click continue next time it pops up? Okay. Let's see what happens. Okay. So under these same policies, it also gave British forces in Palestine various scenarios in which punitive home demolitions would be permitted, which you can see here. Some of these images looking practically looking exactly as images that you would see from the West Bank today. This is the result of a military raid in which food rations were destroyed. They would take flour and grain and pour olive oil or gunpowder in it to make it inedible. And again, this British repression was done for one reason, and nearly one reason only. It was not just to put Palestinians in line with a British colonial program, but rather for their deliberate defiance against the Zionist project. Land theft, illegal immigration, and these things that were actively displacing hundreds of thousands from their land. I would like to mention a figure from around this time, Fouad Hijazi. In 1929, nearly 2 decades before Israel ever existed, Palestinians were mobilizing against Zionist expansion at the hands of the British in Palestine in what would become known as the Al-Buraq Uprising. 3 men were sentenced to death as a result of their participation, including Fouad Hijazi, Atta al-Zir, and Mohammed Jamjoon. So now when we're looking also at Israel now instituting a death penalty policy, we should be dedicating even more time to looking at the ways that this isn't actually the first time that this has been implemented for this cause. So on June 17th, 1930, these 3 men would be executed in the British Akka prison. And the day before his execution, Fouad Hijazi left this last will to his 2 brothers and his mother. My dear brothers, Yusuf and Ahmed, may God bless you. I entrust you to fulfill my will. I advise you to support each other with brotherly love and to work diligently and tirelessly to combat life's hardships, so that you may achieve success in this life's race, which you shall live, inshallah, with honor and happiness. You must not be affected by my execution, for Fouad was created for this moment, and he has the highest honor to die for the Palestinian Arab cause. You must hold your head high among your peers and never allow grief to enter your heart. You should go on outings and celebrate more than before. You must care for your future. If Allah has decreed this fate for me, then you should remain assured and at peace with His divine wisdom. As for me, I forgive all those who testified against me, and tomorrow on the day of judgment, I will meet them and seek my right from Him before Allah Almighty. Take care of your studies and strive in them, and do not allow worry to dominate your life. My dear Ahmed, I was deeply moved by what you said during your visit when you mentioned that you would take revenge for me. This, my dear, does not concern you because I am not only your brother, but I belong to the Arab nation and to all of its people. You must obey your mother and your brother Yusuf. Ahmed, calmness, be serene. My clothes should be preserved for a month, and no other attire should be placed on me except for the shroud and the coffin. Crying, shouting, and wailing are strictly forbidden, as I would never have accepted them during my life, especially tearing your clothes. There should be a celebration and singing. And know that Fuad is not dead, he is merely a groom. The grave will be built at the expense of the Arab Relief Committee in Jerusalem. A garden will be established around my grave with a railing surrounding it. Mother, I give you this will. Remember that a will is precious. Do not visit my grave more than once a week, and do not make it your only task to go to the cemetery. The day of my execution should be a day of joy and celebration. It must be a historical day when speeches are delivered and national anthems are sung to commemorate the blood we shed for Palestine and the Arab cause. I thought it was particularly interesting kind of going through different archives throughout the course of my dissertation and trying to understand if Palestinians themselves during this period kind of were coming to similar conclusions that I was throughout the course of this research, and how they understood British carceral measures that were being imposed against them routinely. This included, for example, the criminalization of the Arab Hire Committee, which wasn't even truly representative of the Palestinian people, but they did understand it as an affront to democracy and representation and a part of a larger scheme to enforce the partition plan. Some very powerful examples that I would find are accounts of Palestinian prisoners that would chant all together in unison that Palestine is Arab, and condemning their British oppressors and their Zionist oppressors as they were being marched to the gallows. There was a clear understanding in this way, even through the slogan that Palestine is Arab, that Palestinians understood the British role in Palestine as an attempt to change Palestine's demographic profile. Now, as Israel would be established, on the eve of its founding, it would terminate its dependence on Britain into its laws, and then simultaneously adopt the Defense Emergency Regulations of 1945, taking out certain passages regarding illegal immigration and allowing any now Israelis in prison to be released. And interestingly enough, dozens of Palestinians that had been arrested during the British Mandate stayed in Israeli custody for years. So yes, it was subject to certain modifications, but it was ultimately continued to be used against Palestinians nearly exclusively. Alina Korn, for instance, says that up until the start of the 1960s, Palestinians accounted for over 45% of Israel's prison population, despite only comprising of around 15% of the general population. Again, confirming the eliminatory nature of these policies and the ways that it kind of worked in tandem with the Nakba to disappear Palestinians en masse. To highlight again the colonial policies, continued targeting of native Palestinians who survived the Nakba. Between 1948 and 1967, 33% of convictions based off the Defense Emergency Regulations were based on movement violations. So what does this mean? This means Palestinians that were attempting to access their farmland, or were traveling without permits, or decided to boycott a permit system in defiance of the new state. So these policies were used, 33% of them at least were used to punish Palestinians for accessing their ancestral land. So moving as a Palestinian, existing as a Palestinian, even spatially in any capacity, was deemed a crime, or kind of these policies were rather revived. Let's see. I don't know if I added this to the slides. On fast forwarding then from 1948 to 1967, when Israel's military occupation of the West Bank and Gaza Strip began, 3 days into the so-called Six-Day War, Israel would revive the military court system in these occupied territories, again, based off the British Mandatory Defense Military Court regulations. An estimated, up until 2010, so before the genocide, an estimated 700,000 to 1 million Palestinians were detained, accounting for around 40% of the entire Palestinian male population and 20% of the general population. But again, this is before the genocide. These numbers have shifted dramatically. And I don't think that for a while we'll understand to what extent they've shifted. So many, tens of thousands of people are still missing. It's a eliminatory function under Israel, at the very least, if we don't want to make the assumption that it functioned in this way during the British Mandate. If we can accept that it functions this way during the Israeli occupation, it can also be highlighted in the rise of arrests and incarceration as a routine response to demands for emancipation, a rejection of Zionism, a rejection of settlement expansion, of land theft, and of military occupation. And we saw these rises also occur during Palestinian uprisings against the Zionist project during the Mandate. During the first Intifada, for example, in 1987, Israel would have the highest per capita prison population in the entire world. I would like to highlight some of, Palestinian prisoners are the jewel on the crown of Palestine, and I want to highlight some of their stories here. This is Khalida Jarrad. She was elected in 2006 onto the Palestine Legislative Council, chairing the Prisoners Commission, served also as the director of prisoner support for Al-Damir, Al-Damir, who was actually just banned or considered a terrorist organization in the US just a few months ago. And as a result of her activism, both political activism, feminist activism, has been imprisoned repeatedly by Israel. It's like an accumulation of all of her time in prison and detention has been over 5 years, and most of this being without any charge, this all being kind of done through administrative detention policy that we talked about. When she is charged, or they do give some kind of explanation as to why she's been imprisoned, the explanations have been her giving speeches, attending vigils, supporting Palestinian prisoners and their families, and membership in an illegal organization. But remember, illegal organizations include the vast majority of all Palestine's political factions. But she continued throughout these 5 years in prison to resist behind bars, training and creating tawjihi programs for Palestinian students, young girls that were coming into prison during high school, and used her educational background, organizing background, and expertise to create these programs for students, and saw cohort after cohort of students graduating from high school despite being in prison. I think that Israel's elimination policy through incarceration can be seen through Khalida's story, despite her unending resistance, which continues until this day, through a variety of things. One particularly heartbreaking example that I thought of was the death of her daughter Suha, who had like a director position at Al-Haq. She died, I don't remember when she died, it was a few years ago, but Khalida was in detention under administrative detention orders. Her order was set to expire within like the next month, and they refused to let her attend her daughter's funeral. She's been subjected to intense torture. The United Nations, for example, found a few years ago that when solitary confinement is used for more than 15 consecutive days, this is when it constitutes as torture and when the impacts of it become irreversible, including the shortening of one's life, one's ability to retain memory, physically shrinking that segment of the brain, hallucinations, illusions, paranoia, delirium, and suicidal ideation. During Khalida's most recent time in detention, She was in solitary confinement for 5 consecutive months. And then, of course, their repeated attempts to repress Palestinian political activity and representation, self-determination, and attempting to thwart her resistance behind bars, i.e. her educational programs, routinely going in and taking their pencils or their whiteboards or whatever. But they continue to resist. They launch hunger strikes. They protest in their cells. And these young girls graduate no matter what. Next is another example of Palestinian resistance and resilience, but also the ways in which these policies are used in an eliminatory fashion, is the story of Walid Dhaka, who was in prison for years and years and was diagnosed with cancer, then denied treatment. They denied him any semblance of a family life, and he resisted, and with the help of smugglers, his wife gave birth to his daughter Milad, Arabic for birth. This little cutie right here. But as a result of being denied access to cancer treatment, he died slowly in his cell. And died slowly in his cell before being taken to the hospital and died in the hospital. Just recently, just a few months back, his wife, Sana, would also be detained. So they're doing everything in their power to punish this child for what her parents did, for what her father did. Her mother was in prison for a while, but subsequently released, but continues to advocate for prisoners and the remembrance of her beloved late husband. Now this is a more recent case. This is Mohammed Ibrahim, U.S. citizen, Florida resident, 16 years old. On February 16th of this year, he was detained in his family home near his village in Ramallah for allegedly throwing rocks at settlers. These same settlers would, a couple months later, on July 11th, kill his brother, kill his cousin, Saifullah, also a U.S. citizen. These settlers that killed his cousin would be released from prison almost immediately. No charges, no nothing. But Muhammad, 16-year-old Muhammad, for throwing stones remains in prison until now, along with more than 500 other Palestinian children. This exemplifies to us the role of unchilding, of stealing childhoods from Palestinian children, whether that's the daily rituals of watching their parents or their fathers humiliated at checkpoints, mothers abused during military raids, the killing of their friends at school, raids on their school, and then, of course, the imprisonment, torture of themselves. Muhammad now is infected with scabies all over his body. Trump has not said anything or acknowledged the imprisonment of this U.S. citizen. So I would urge you all to go onto Instagram and follow this account. It's run by his family, who is continuously advocating for his release. So if you're all able to do that, that would be fantastic. All of these stories truly are a testament to the ways in which prisons kind of encompass every element of Palestinian life and work in tandem with Israel's ongoing genocide, its ongoing Nakba in Palestine, but also goes again to prove the centrality and the critical support that we